Questions of Doom. Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who's asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, today's question comes from Mike B in the US, and it represents something of a perennial concern. Every year, certainly students will come back to this debate, maybe when they first discover it or when they have a new thought about it, and sometimes long-standing professional archaeologists will have this quandary to tackle, and that is the relationship between history and archaeology, and in particular the liminal zone of historical archaeology, this sort of this border, this boundary, this grey area that for some represents an argument. The question goes as follows. Hello, Mr. Soup. I'm interested in mainly historical archaeology, which not many archaeologists are interested in. And I was wondering why that was. My advisor said that many archaeologists find historical archaeology boring, because we already know what happened due to historical records. I was wondering what your thoughts are on historical archaeology. Thank you for your time, Mr. Soup. Mike B. Well, as I say, Mike, this is a question which people do return to, and especially students. You mentioned in your notes that you're a second-year archaeologist, and I remember in the first and second year of archaeology, of my time studying archaeology, rather, that people were having very passionate debates about this, and this is partly because there is an argument that, for example, history is superior. You know, historical inquiry has the backup of documents, written accounts, people like Samuel Pepys's diaries and this kind of thing, maps, ledgers, trade records, and all sorts of other little scraps of paper that can really add colour and scope to a period of history if you want to do your research. And so therefore lots of historians they say aha, we have the understanding, and therefore also archaeologists go, ugh, how boring, there's no questions to be answered, there's no grand schemes to figure out. Basically it's just a case of going through a series of books and trying to find something original in for example, Samuel Pepys's diaries. How dull. So historians and archaeologists sometimes argue about history from that sort of perspective. In particular, for example, when it comes to 20th century archaeology, I remember actually when I first was studying the archaeology of Britain and we got to the 20th century bit, I was just like, oh, come on, how dull. I don't want to learn about 20th century archaeology. What is there to know? So the assumption is there, and I once made that assumption myself. The other end of the spectrum is that there are arguments against archaeology as being unsubstantiated guesswork. This is particularly levelled at, for example, prehistory and prehistorians. Historians will go, what you say? You found some chips of stone, and now you're talking about Stonehenge as a healing centre. What? Where's the evidence? And therefore there is an assumption that there's less rigour in archaeology. That somehow actually we are simply making things up, and that we don't particularly care about hard and strong standards of evidence, and therefore it's not particularly respected by historians. But that said, though, archaeologists often love archaeology because of the puzzle, because we are trying to fill in these fairly substantial blanks, and because there isn't a written record, especially in prehistory, we're having to think about this stuff much more carefully. So there is to a certain extent a certain sort of duality, a certain dichotomy which exists, which does cause arguments and friction. And I've come across some of these criticisms, in particular when it comes to medievalists. I have a couple of medievalist friends who are tongue in cheek, but nonetheless fairly scathing of especially prehistory. precisely because they consider prehistorians to be hippies who are just making stuff up as they go along. Now, it's at this point that I'm reminded of my supervisor in uni, a chap called Chris Capel. Now, I recently filmed an interview with him, and it took me a long time to get him to agree to appear on camera. But he is a wonderful conservator, and he has some excellent, I suppose, philosophy when it comes to the relationship between things, history, and our intervention with those things. I'll come back to this towards the end of the video, but I will also put a link actually to his interview at the end of this video. But the reason why I'm reminded of him is because his PhD was exactly in this zone. He actually dealt with pins coming into a medieval port, and he was fascinated by the amounts of these materials that were coming through, and also how those materials stacked up against the written evidence. And it really highlighted that there was a certain mental block for the historian who had the documents, because they were going, but there's no evidence of these pins coming, and they're not on the ledger. And he was going, but they're here. Look, I have some. And what he had found essentially was the stuff that was not written down. He had found the contraband, and also he had found precisely the reason why you shouldn't take written documents at face value. A good historian is always looking for the hidden agenda, primary evidence, secondary evidence, tertiary evidence, and querying the motivation behind that evidence. And so, he walks this line, and certainly in his PhD, he walked that line very carefully. And it was really highlighting the relationship between the physical remains of the past and the historical understanding of the past. Both can criticize one another, but also both can augment one another. And I think this is the key, and this is something which I'll come back to. Now, the thing is, when it comes to historical archaeology, the picture is complex. As I say, the relationship between the physical remains and the documents is crucial, because documents can help you find physical remains can help you better understand documents. But in Britain, historical archaeology is actually quite a broad church, as it were. It's quite a broad community. This is really highlighted actually in this book here. This is my copy of The Archaeology of Britain. It's about 10 years old now. I need to get a new copy, but it is an excellent book, and it says, an introduction from the Upper Paleolithic to the Industrial Revolution. And in here, towards the end of the book, there are chapters written by people like Kate Clark and let's see, Ian White, this kind of thing, examining precisely the history of archaeology, which is not. Yes, I highlighted the book to hell and back. Archaeology, which is not, or rather say, which is especially post-medieval, but also into more recent times. For example, we have Iron Bridge in I think Shropshire, which is a key part in the Industrial Revolution. So this book really did a great job of actually highlighting that historical archaeology is a big part of the archaeological story of Britain. And that includes, for example, let's see, 20th century archaeology. As I say, I remember being really not inspired by the thought of 20th century archaeology when I first came across it in uni, but actually there's a lot there. Just last year, actually, I was working with, and indeed I'll be working with again, I think this year. I was working with the Homefront Legacy Project and the Young Archaeologists Club on a project which is helping people to examine First World War archaeology in the cities where they live. The home front of the First World War, which is actually essentially a hidden sphere of architecture usually, and also map data, and sometimes actual archaeological remains, as other people would define them, like in forests and things like that. And this sphere exists in such a way that it is not easily understood just through historical record. You need to log and to record and to find the physical remains in order to actually understand it better. So that, First World War, Second World War, things like pillboxes, famously. I think there's a place called Shooter's Hill in London where there was a pillbox made to look like, I think, some sort of post office. I might be wrong, but some sort of small shop or something. And if there was ever an invasion of Britain, as there might have been in the 1940s, someone from a local defence force could be in there sniping down the hill. Beyond that, you have obviously things like living standards. The changing history of architecture in Britain in the last 100 years has been very interesting. For example, in the post-World War period, we had lots of prefab houses, houses being built out of very temporary materials, but nonetheless some people are still living in them today. These are relics, which I'll come back to again at the end. So that's the 20th century. In the 19th century, we have everything from slums, Victorian slums, like there's a site called Hungate in York, which was, when I was working there, they just finished the Victorian period, although they were finishing it as I started working there. Um, and basically, what they uncovered was the story of slum housing, terraces which had been thrown up just to get for people to pay minimal rent but live in terrible conditions. No stairs, for example, it's the ladder up and down stairs. Very dangerous in terms of the gas supply. And again, this is the detail of life coming out of archaeology. But not only the slums, but also the grander houses. So you have the contrast of the way in which people are living. There's the civic architecture, the effort to which the Victorians in particular put into their grand structures, for example, with regards to, say, pump houses for sewage systems, really tells you something about how they approached their sense of civic duty and what it meant to have, for example, a healthy population. And this is, again, physical remains, archaeology, and especially architectural archaeology coming to the fore. The canal networks of Britain, another crucial part of this story, and a story which is linked further back in time to, for example, the Industrial Revolution. As I say, there's places like Iron Bridge, there is the canal network which linked great sort of industrial cities that were rising up, in particular sites such as at Manchester. Every now and then there's a tremendous archaeological project going on in Manchester that is examining precisely historical archaeology. It's looking at, for example, the ways in which factories worked. Now, yes, we know about factories and documentary evidence. We know about the working conditions and, broadly speaking, what they were producing. But sometimes the mechanical specifics of how you get the machine to work can only be understood via the archaeology, and you won't know what you don't know until you've looked at it physically, as opposed to just assuming, oh well, here the diagram says that this went from there to there, and when actually it didn't in real life. So again, archaeology bringing those contexts and bringing the little details to life. And also, as I say, once again, living standards comes into play there. The rise of industry from cottage industries like sort of cloth production as well is part of that story. The rise of townscapes in places like the city of Bath down south, or Bath. They have grand Georgian vistas, which are part of, an architectural and archaeological story of Britain. And actually, that's also echoed here in the northeast. Newcastle, just about a couple of miles up the road from where I live, has tremendous Georgian architecture. Arguably one of the best theatre fronts in all of Britain in the Theatre Royal. And this is physical remains. Yes, okay, there are documents of that stuff, but you need an archaeologist to help to understand and record this stuff. And in that sense, yes, you're being part surveyor at times, part historian, but you're also being an archaeologist. And I think archaeology is it's a very broad set of skills, and it shouldn't be dismissed. We have the stories of stately homes, cathedrals and castles, which shaped the landscape here in Britain in historic times. Yes, there's documentation, but the evidence and the reality of that stuff can only be understood through archaeology. For example, Durham Cathedral, not too far from where I live, obviously where I went to uni. And they have an on-site archaeologist whose job it is to do actually an ongoing status report of the site, so we understand the erosion and what needs fixing. But also, actually, it's just a truism that physically being in the building is different to reading about it, and that's one of the values of having an on-site archaeologist. The stories of the landscape changing through garden projects, people like Capability Brown changing huge swathes of the English countryside at the behest of the owners of stately homes, building fake archaeological monuments, follies, for example, in the countryside. All of this is part of historical archaeology. And also, for example, the abandonment of medieval villages. I've done a video previously, I'll put a link, I think, to this one at the end of the video as well, about precisely this, the fact that, abandoned medieval villages can reveal so much about the reality of living, not only in terms of the life conditions and physical dimensions of where you can live, but also the fact that actually these spaces are quite dynamic. The assumption that was made in the past that the lord of the manor has always been here isn't necessarily true, that actually these spaces were open to change, civic planning and all this kind of thing. And again, this is revealed through physical study of the site. It's not revealed through documentary evidence. So, yes, in Britain there's quite a lot to talk about, but you may be thinking, yeah, that's all well and good. That's all well and good, Mr. Soup, but I live in America and we don't have abandoned medieval villages. And this is true, especially America and other, broadly speaking, I suppose, New World countries might define themselves as having limited archaeology. But historical archaeology is therefore actually an even bigger part of the story. The jump from native and prehistoric archaeologies, especially, for example, in America, to European influenced archaeology, is so big that in Mesoamerica you have pre and post Columbian contact as a terminology, and in the case of the US. Yes, there has been a renaissance in recent years in the study of native and prehistoric sites and a willingness to understand the nuances of that archaeology. But so too, that the same can and should be accepted of the colonial story, of the relationship between, yes, the first arrivals, how those stories spread out through the US, for example, the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, and the British influences, but also less obvious stuff, and stuff which I think archaeology is best at. For example, last year, 2016, there was a wonderful story, I'll put a link to it in the video description below, where deep in the swamps, archaeologists are finding how fugitive slaves kept their freedom. This is a story which, again, by definition was not written down. Not only is it possible that those people couldn't write their own story, but also, more to the point, you didn't want to record it necessarily because you might get caught. But archaeology is revealing that story, and who can argue that any of this stuff isn't interesting? So there's plenty, I'd say, to say for historical archaeology, and I would say that at no point is the fact that there are documents to support what it is, or to criticise, or to shape, or to inform what it is that archaeology is finding, means that actually the archaeology is any less necessary. The US, for example, will have similar questions to be answered in terms of, for example, the rise of industry, the coming of civic planning and the way in which cities were laid out. And sure, some of this stuff wasn't as influenced as it by the past as it was, for example, in a city like York, where certain streets have been there since Roman times. But that just means that actually the answers are different and in some ways more interesting. I would love to know more about the physical relationship between the modern surface and the original town layout, and how those decisions were made, and also what problems came about, through, for example, drainage issues, this kind of thing. No, it's not super sexy, it's not Stonehenge, it's not Romans, it's not Vikings, but it is crucial, and it is, I think, it's all about how you choose to tell that story. There's one final thought as well that I would put forward, and that is that on the fringes of historical archaeology, you also have some fascinating potential. Again, I'm coming back to Europe here, but I think the same can be said, for example, of contact periods in the US and Australia and so on and so forth. That, for example, we have here one of my favourite books, and that is The Real Middle Earth, Magic and Mystery in the Dark Ages. Now, this is a reference, obviously, to Tolkien, and more broadly speaking, to the old Germanic concept of Midgard, Middle Earth, being the world on which we live, and one of many worlds in a pantheon of worlds occupied by gods and elves and dwarves. But this, I suppose, more than that, it represents the fact that actually there's on this fringe where history and written documentation starts to become less reliable, there is a real opportunity to ask questions about the way in which we interpret archaeology, whether or not actually how we're interpreting the physicality of, say, the Saxon world actually tallies up with what they wrote about themselves, but also actually how what all of that has been producing is become and has become mythology. For example, the fact that we're talking about a period when lots of people would say that at the beginning of this period there was a King Arthur, all this kind of thing. There's an opportunity there to use historical methodology, historical archaeology as well, to really interrogate how it is that history becomes myth, and the relationship between a culture which we don't understand much about, a culture which we understand quite a lot about, and then a culture, for example, that we are living today in the form of modern Western society. It's kind of hard to explain, but I think there's a power there when it comes to historical archaeology. This transition from, I suppose, actually from the classical world and from prehistory and the Iron Age through into modernity, through into history and historical archaeology. That is a fascinating transition, and it's one which is only going to be moving in time. Eventually, as documents wither, as archaeology crumbles, that misunderstanding or that blurry zone will be transitioning. So yeah, there's something there, I think, as well that's worthwhile thinking about. So just to return back to my former tutor, Chris Capel, the value of his work in using artifacts and examining artifacts is that he actually, in some ways, a little bit like this idea of intervening in these moments of fate of an artifact and its transition. He intervenes in an artifact's life to try and make a decision about what it is at that point and where it's going next. Essentially, everything is on its way to becoming dust. It's a fundamental thermodynamic law of the universe. We all move from a state of order to a state of disorder. This is represented in, quite simply, the fact that we age and die, for example, or buildings crumble and collapse. And Chris and his work is almost irrelevant of whether or not the artifact is historical, prehistoric, or medieval. His work really highlights how archaeology brings that extra element to the table. And so often coming through his lab, he'll have elements from sites such as Beamish, which is an open air museum in the north of England, which does have those prefab houses I talked about, even because people are starting to recognise those as worthwhile trying to preserve. So things from the 20th century, 19th century, 17th century, these come through his lab, and so do prehistoric items as well. So do little lumps of corrosion, now medieval nails and this kind of thing. And so again, I think what he represents and what that work represents is the universality of archaeology. The fact that actually archaeology has a universal usefulness when it comes to stuff and the context of stuff. And once you accept that, questions about historicity or prehistory kind of melt away. When you understand that actually archaeologists in some ways are the people who deal with the stuff of history. This is an artifact, and one day it may disappear. And while it's here, I can study it, and my understanding of it will help other people understand other things. Maybe that's really what we need to be reflecting on, is the fact that archaeology is that moment, and it's an opportunity to get data, to get information, and to add to our own and other people's understanding. I don't know if that's helpful, but hopefully it helps you to move on from this idea that, he said here that your advisor said that many archaeologists find it boring because we already know what happened because of historical records. Well, that's not true. That patently isn't true. All the way through this video, I've been trying to highlight elements of where archaeology and historical records both clash, but also they help one another. And if nothing else, hopefully this has helped you to sort of to add to those thoughts and move forward. So yes, historical archaeology is exciting. It can be very funky, and in the case of, for example, if you're wanting to talk about it with people, it's all about how you bring that topic forward and how you present it. Share your passion. You may think other people aren't interested, but don't assume that. Show them why it's interesting. Show them why you have an interest in historical archaeology, and we'll come along for the ride with you. Anyway, Mike, once again, thank you so much for asking that question. Hopefully this hasn't been too much of a rambling answer, but I really wanted to try and get this one right, and to try and give you some solid food for thought. As ever, guys, if you have any questions or comments, please do comment below. I'm sure Mike would love to read them. I certainly would. And until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.